We were talking about the start of World.
Oh, okay.
We can also talk about World War I.
Oh, we can do both.
This is the POG lead up.
Oh,
This is the gamer crisis that started it all.
oh. The game. I don't like that terminology.
The gamer crisis.
That's what they say in the textbooks.
When I was reading G.J. Myers' The World Undone, in the introduction, it actually said World War I was kind of POG. And that's where I get that terminology from. But so I mean, it's, you hear people talk about the start of World War I, but they kind of want to just start in August, right? June, July, and August of 1914, because that's when it's like, okay, shit's popping off right here. These people are cutting diplomatic ties, it's just happening, and it's like, okay, we're really getting into it. I think it's not as appropriate to start there, because you really have, it's a slow build, right? So tensions were high going up into 1914. But it really kind of starts in like the late 1800s, in like 1880s, 1890s, as Germany becomes a country in, I think, 1863 or 1865, one of those two days. And Bismarck's really getting it done over there, and he's got Kaiser Wilhelm the First, and it's it's going all right for Germany. And Bismarck was a smart dude, so he was like, all right, we got to get this sense of pride in the German state. So they really do that, and you start seeing them flex their muscles a little bit, because they are a powerful nation even from the get-go, right? So they quickly gain a lot of economic power and capital, and they're able to industrialize fairly quickly along with Britain to start kind of dominating Central Europe, whereas they had never really done that before, and it was France to the west and Russia to the east, and nothing really in the middle than a buffer zone between those two guys. And then you have Germany pop up and like, hey, what's up? We're Prussia and German states, and we're like, we make stuff and we do that well. So that kind of scares everybody, especially the French, because in the 1880s, that's already after the Franco-Prussian War, where France got slapped down like the little bitches they are against this brand new country. So that kind of feels shitty for them. So we have this kind of new emerging country that has a mind towards military, and now it's getting economic ability to back that up. Well, initially that doesn't really bother anybody except France, but who gives a shit about that? So Britain was kind of like, whatever, Germany's doing its thing. Maybe the continent will balance out a little. Because up until that point, France kind of just dominated everything. And Britain's general foreign policy for Europe was, as long as everything's kind of equal, it's fine, right? So here comes Germany, and they're reaching a point where they're pretty equal with France. And then you've got Austria-Hungary kind of down there in the south, kind of still just existing. And then Russia, who is the kind of sleeping giant over in the east, who isn't really much of a problem in the late 1800s. So as the 1880s progress, Wilhelm I is still in power, and he's more or less a puppet of Otto von Bismarck, which is fine because Otto von Bismarck is very smart, and he knows when to fight battles and when to deal with things politically. Well, this starts to change in the early 1890s because the Wilhelm I dies, and then his son is supposed to take over, and his name is Frederick III. Frederick has a lot of things that he's planning on doing because he is of the liberal mindset, which there had never been any German ruler who thought that way. More progressive thoughts of, getting rid of absolute monarchy, moving towards a constitutional monarchy that limits the emperor's power and gives more of a decision people. Well, no one else liked that except for him and his wife. And this goes back to the unfortunate part, because if he was emperor for a long time, then things probably would have turned out very differently. But he wasn't, because he got throat cancer when he was crowned as the emperor. So he lasted all of a couple months. It really do be like that. And because of the throat cancer, he couldn't even do anything when he was emperor, because he couldn't talk. Which is like ultra cucked. Yeah, ultra cucked.
That sucks.
Right? So then he dies, right? His son, Wilhelm II, takes over right after he dies. So he grows up and, he has this military style of thinking, and he very, has a lot of pride in that. Unfortunately, he's kind of a cripple. It's hard to tell if you look at a picture of Wilhelm II, but his left arm, I believe he was born breech, so they had to position his body in such a way to have him not be dead, that they broke his arm and it did not grow correctly. So his left arm being nigh on pretty much useless made it very difficult for him to properly be part of the military. So he got all of the military attitude, but none of the actual military experience because he wasn't ever in a actual role.
He's all he ever did was he's a LARPer.
He's LARPing, yes. And it's funny you say that, because he literally was LARPing. Almost anywhere he went, he would wear the top uniform for every branch of the military. And he was just LARPing all the time. And he had every medal. Going back to Britain, they have some issues in the 1890s with the Boer Wars, where a bunch of shithead Dutch farmers in the southern part of Africa dunk on them like a bunch of bitches. And there are countries that side with Britain on that issue, and then there are countries that side with the Boers. So the Dutch side with the Boers because they're Dutch people. The big thing was the Germans were like, do we help them because fuck the English, or do we say, okay, England, go get them? They ended up coming down as not really either, so the British didn't like that because they wouldn't stand for them because they're little salty bitches. But you see this kind of wishy-washy aspect of this with the Germans because Wilhelm gets rid of Otto von Bismarck in 1891. And then it's actually kind of funny because right after that, Otto von Bismarck puts out a book and he's like, Wilhelm II's completely incompetent and he's a terrible leader. So Wilhelm comes back with, no, Bismarck, you're a fucking moron, which he's definitely not. And it's funny because if you ever look at his Bismarck's biography, because it's in his biography too. It's like the third book of his biography is part of it's just shitting on Wilhelm because he's stupid. So after 1891, on each other.
It's fucking hilarious.
But after 1891, Bismarck's not there to guide Germany, and the only one that's left is Wilhelm. And yeah, so, going into 1900, you've got no Bismarck in Germany. The French are kind of intimidated by the Germans at this point. Austria-Hungary's bumbling around, and Russia that is getting better as far as technology goes and becoming more important economically as well, to a point that Russia and France become allies because they're afraid of Germany. So that's all going into 1900. And then you have a series of crises that happen before 1910, two of which happened in Morocco. The first one in Morocco is a result of Kaiser Wilhelm trying to be like the British, and he wants two things to be like the British. He wants to have an empire and have a navy to patrol his empire. Well, that's difficult as Germany has no colony. Well, they have a couple, but they don't really have much. But this goes entirely against what Bismarck was saying Germany should do. Part of this is trying to expand Germany's reach in Africa. And Germany was like, we want a slice of the Moroccan pie as well. I believe the first issue was, the Germans wanted to take that over and start to establish something there. And the French were like, no, you're not going to do that. But the Germans really wanted to do it, but ended up relenting and not doing that, and it ended up subsiding. But the bigger stink came in 1905 when it was found out that the French were directly influencing the ministers of banks in Morocco to take French loans and only French loans and no one else. The Germans were like, yeah, that's not very fair. We want some Morocco too. And the French were like, nah, no. So they started getting all huffy at each other and ended up deciding to kind of split it 50-50, but France was still fucking the Germans by getting the better half of the 50-50 of the spheres of influence of Morocco. Those two things were generally revolved around Africa and having issues with the Germans trying to get more territory there. Now, the way I explained it may not sound like it was, that big of a deal, but keep in mind that both of these things that happened here over these colonies could have both turned into war. And Germany really wanted colonies, like really bad. And everyone knew it, and they were like, maybe we'll just give Germany a little bit of stuff and they'll go away and stop complaining. And they kind of did, but it didn't really work long term. So a lot of this, as I'm talking so far, is focused on Germany, and that's because Kaiser Wilhelm II is a fucking moron. But then we start getting into the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, and these are the other two events that are more directly related to World War I. So I mentioned the other crises and stuff because you get more of a sense of why things are so tense. So you have the Germans building up their navy, attempting to get colonies overseas. This starts to threaten the British position on both of those fronts. The British, of course, have the biggest navy in the world and the strongest navy, but the Germans are well-equipped economically, well-equipped technologically as well, to a point where they're like copying British designs or making better British ships and making them larger. So one of the innovations that the British had was to come up with the Dreadnought class ship, which were big boys, big chunky boys that the Germans were beginning to steal not super long before World War I happened. And that pissed them off a lot because they were very proud of their big boy ship. It was their toy, nobody else's. And like I said, generally this whole time as Germany starts to get more economically powerful and more stable, France and Russia are kind of quaking in their boots, waiting for them to try and take more land in Europe. France was still kind of mad about Alsace and Lorraine because the Germans had it after they beat them in the Franco-Prussian War. But also during this whole period, the French aren't really focusing on international affairs because they keep having stupid shit happen in their country. I think in 1905, 1907, something like that. They had the Dreyfus Affair, which is very stupid. Essentially, they come up to this officer. I don't know what rank he was. There's an officer in the French military, and they're like, hey, you, Dreyfus, why are you spying for the Germans? And he's like, I'm not. And they said, bullshit. And they throw him in jail. And then they have a trial. And they say, you're guilty. But up until they say you have, for whatever reason, this becomes a very big thing in France. And it's like a big thing to the public as well. So you've got people that are Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. People for Dreyfus and against Dreyfus thinking he's a traitor. Well, that gets to be to a point where people are like fighting in the street over that for whatever reason, because they're Frenchmen, I guess. And so they convict him of being a traitor, and then they let it go a couple years. Well, he appeals his case, and then more evidence comes out. They just made shit up for the trial. It was just not true. So then you had the Dreyfus thing pop up a second time, like a couple years later. Now all your anti-Dreyfusards and Dreyfusards come back out in droves, and they're either arguing for him or against him, and he eventually gets acquitted after spending like 8 years in prison. Yeah, so they're dealing with this whole Dreyfus Affair thing. The next thing that happens chronologically would be the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, and those happen because the Balkan countries are kind of tired of the Ottomans. They're like, hey, Ottomans, stop ruling us. And they're like, no. So the Balkan states are like, okay, it's war. And the Ottomans are a country that I haven't touched on at all because no one cares about them, because they are in such a state of decline that there's almost not entirely no point to talk about. They are so weak and corrupt that pretty much all of the countries are talking about when they will fall. But the general policy is, hey, this is going to cause a big problem when this happens, and everyone's going to want all their land. So let's just keep them as a country for longer so we don't have to deal with that, because the Russians want access to the Dardanelles, which is Black Sea port, I think. So it would really give the Russians access to the Mediterranean and a lot more trading. So they really want the Dardanelles. The French and British want more Middle East stuff because why not? And the Germans just want everything they can get. So everybody kind of wants this slice of Turkish pie, but they don't want it now, right? They're a little full. Right? They don't want to have to fight over the pie, so they're going to let it cool a little bit, and then they're going to see what happens. As a result of them being weak, the shitty little Balkan countries, Serbia, Croatia, blah, 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 Bosnia and all that kind of shit. They're like, hey guys, let's make an alliance. We're gonna attack the Ottomans and we're gonna drive them out. And they're like, sweet, let's do it. And they do it. And it's great. And you know, it's successful. So they pushed them out of the Balkans. And then it hits 1913. And then Bulgaria is like, hey, Serbia, that's some nice land you got. And the Serbians are like, hey, Bulgaria, that's some nice land you got there. It's a real shame if someone took it. So barely a year after they beat the Ottomans, you have Bulgaria just kind of trying to roll in on Serbia and Greece and just take all their shit, because why not? But it doesn't really work, and it's kind of a standstill sort of thing. But it's enough to go, hey man, we were friends, says Serbia and Bulgaria. And Bulgaria's like, nah, I don't give a fuck with you guys. I was Kangs and shit. So Bulgaria was trying to be big Bulgaria again, which would have required them to also fight Romania, but they didn't do that. So these wars, which nobody was sure what they were going to do. In the end, I believe Austria didn't really do anything to stop these things from happening. I think I don't think they aided either side in either of those. But everyone kind of just sitting back and watching what happened. But there was this, I guess we have to talk about Russia a little bit more now. So Serbia got this cool idea that they're basically Russia's little brother. And they're like, hey, big brother Russia, can you protect us and stuff in case the Austrians attack us and also all the other Slavs? Because, you know, we're Slavs, you're Slavs. That's pretty cool, huh? They're like, yeah, we are all Slavs. That is pretty cool. Anyways, Pan-Slavs. So Pan-Slavism was a general idea that, you know, all the Slavs had to stick together, whether you're a Russian or Serbian or anybody who they would consider a Slav, should stick together and help each other. The closest bond between those countries was between Serbia and Russia. And there was a fear in Serbia and the other Balkan countries like Montenegro and Croatia was that as soon as they gain any kind of independence from the Ottomans, the Austrians would roll in and just take them over. So there's a lot of talk back and forth between Serbia and Russia about, hey, if they do this, will you protect us? And there was kind of a meh response from Russia. It was like, we could. We really don't want to, as we're not ready for a war yet, but we could. As a result, the Serbians took that as a guarantee that they would protect them, no matter what they did. So it didn't matter if Bulgaria was attacking them. It was like, hey, Russia, you want to help us and shit? While the Russians didn't directly intervene, they were like, here are some guns and stuff. So at the end of 1913, tensions are high, not only between the big European countries, but also now between the small Balkan countries as well, because they just fought each other and nothing happened. Along with European Slavism and stuff like that, for Serbia, there were still Serbians living in Austria-Hungary. And some of those Serbians were like, hey, they should be part of our country. And you want to know what the Austrians said? No. So you had some, you know, terrorist organizations pop up and they're like, hey, why don't we overthrow the monarchy of Austria and get our people back? And other people were like, that's a great idea. Most of everyone else said that's a terrible idea, including the government, depending on who you listen to. Other people will say that the Serbian government was giving money to these terrorist organizations. The biggest of them, I believe, was called the Black Hand. You know, going through 1913 and into 1914 with this group that's, you know, the Serbians are already militant. And these Balkan countries are already militant and ready to rock and roll again. So the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was getting sent to Sarajevo, which was part of the Austrian Empire that was Serbian, as like a, hey guys, what's up? Well, I'm a cool guy. You guys like me, right? Which a lot of them did, surprisingly enough. And it's kind of funny for the whole situation, because Franz Ferdinand, well, he was kind of a cock. He didn't really want to fight a war and was willing to come up with some other kind of diplomatic solution to war so that didn't have to happen, because he knew, and pretty much everybody in Austria knew, if there was a war, they probably wouldn't exist anymore. So if there was anybody that was a bigger proponent for Serbia existing as its own country and not getting fucked with, it would probably be him. The Serbian Black Hand society or whatever they were called. It's like, hey, let's go kill that guy, because assassination was very, very popular last 5 years in Europe because there were a lot of assassinations. So yeah, they roll up. The Franz Ferdinand was supposed to be riding around in a car, and Gavrilo Princip and the rest of his motley gang had little bombs that they were going to throw at the cars, and then if that didn't kill them, they were going to shoot them. It's not only Franz Ferdinand, but it's also his wife Sophie, that everybody that was from the Balkans liked, but they didn't really want to kill her. They just wanted to kill him. So they roll up on his car as where they knew it was going to be coming, throw these fucking bombs at it, and I think they all miss, or one of them doesn't detonate, but either way, they don't blow the car up. So then they start like shooting at him, but they have shitty little handguns and none of them hit him. So the driver's able to get away from them and the terrorists flee. And unlike a sane person would do, Franz Ferdinand's like, oh yeah, that's fine. We'll just keep going with what we planned. Like,
what?
Oh.
What?
Okay. Because the plan was to like have lunch and go to a local hospital. So they planned to still go to the hospital, but as the driver had kind of gotten away as quickly as he could, he was trying to get a shortcut to get back en route to go to the hospital. Well, Buddy Boy makes a wrong turn and just so happens to end up to where Gavrilo Princip ran off to. So he fucking shoots them both dead. And fucked up, yeah. There's a lot more. There's more to it than that, right? And all this building of tension stuff. But at the end of the day, it boils down to
it was that guy's fault.
This dude made a wrong turn. Yeah, he dies to Serbian hands, right? Because they catch Gavrilo Princip, find out he's Serbian, and he ends up dying of tuberculosis. Everyone in Austria is like, we didn't really like him anyway. Not a big deal. And then some fucking big brain people high up were like, wait a second, we don't like Serbians. We could attack them because of this. So they bumble around like a bunch of fucking morons for like 3 weeks. Then they're like, hey, Serbia, not cool, dude. We know that your government assisted in the assassination of our Archduke, who is next in line to be on the throne. And the Serbians were like, no, that's not what happened. They didn't actually send anything over to Austria saying that because Austria didn't give them the chance. Because they sent them an ultimatum that was like, hey, respond to this thing within 48 hours. And oh, by the way, you have to let our police into your country to do the investigation. You have to... It was a list of like 12 demands. And they were so outrageous that it was like no sovereign country would be expected to do this. Like I said, it was one of they were told that the Austrian police were to go in and investigate the assassination, and that the Serbians were supposed to like give up any process for them in their criminal system for this, and a bunch of other things. I implore people, if anybody watches this, to look at the list yourself and go, hey, that kind of sucks. But at the end of the day, the Serbians agreed to everything except for allowing the Austrians to come in and control their criminal justice system, and that's kind of reasonable. But they also sent it back with amendments that were like, hey, if you come up with something more reasonable, we will accept, because they really didn't want to go to war. Like I said, this was about a month after the guy was dead, so they weren't very quick about this. So while this is going down, you have Kaiser Wilhelm on his annual yacht trip to Norway, and no one tells him about it. So the German prime minister decides to not tell Wilhelm initially, as they're like, yeah, we'll figure it out. So, but he figures it, he learns about it on his yacht eventually, and he's like, don't worry, guys, I'm coming back. We'll figure this out. There won't be war. And everyone in the Reichstag was like, maybe stay in the water. Maybe that's not the greatest idea. So, and on this matter, like everything else, Wilhelm is fucking wishy-washy, and people cite stuff about him, government memos and stuff like that he would get. He would write comments on them that are like fucking outrageous. So it would be like Trump sending out a tweet that's like, let's fucking nuke North Korea. Right? That's the kind of shit he would say on these. That's what he would write on these fucking memos, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the times it was completely counter to whatever he actually thought, because I read in several places that were his own writing that he did not want to have a war, But then he would write shit on a memo like, let's kick him in the pants, those fucking pussies. It's like, what are you doing? Like, what? It's fucking astounding, honestly. And I always talk about World War I as it's essentially the perfect storm of fuck-ups and retards that are all leading countries that caused this to happen, as it was entirely avoidable. The war of fuck-ups and retards.
I mean, it sounds like
really.
It.
So Wilhelm is like trying to tell the Austrians like, hey, maybe don't go to war. That's probably not a good idea because then the Russians will go to war. And then because the Russians are going to war, the French will go to war. And then it'd be a whole big mess. But at the same time, he also told them, hey, if you guys get into a conflict, we will back you up 100%. 100% we'll back you up. But hey, don't go to war. All right, and people will call this what he told the Austrians as the blank check. It's like, hey, you guys can act with impunity because you're being backed by the Germans. And they're like, sweet. All right, fuck these people. We're going to get what we want from them. And they send the ultimatum.
That's amazingly stupid.
So the Serbians respond with something that is pretty satisfactory. Like I said, they agree to everything except for one point. But then they were open for discussion about that. And then the Austrians were like, nah, not good enough. We're declaring war. Meanwhile, everybody else in the European community was like, wait. Maybe don't go and try and conquer their whole country, right? Maybe just stop in Belgrade, right? Maybe just take the capital, say, hey, you got to stop doing what you're doing down here, and that'll be it. But the Austrians were like, nah, that's some pushy shit. We're not doing that. So the Austrians mobilized for war. The Serbians mobilized for war. The Russians are like, how much do we like the Serbians? Well, it turns out they like the Serbians to a point where they're like, hey, Austria, don't bully the Serbians. Otherwise, we're going to go to war. And that kind of made the Austrians think a little bit. They're like, do we really want to go to war? Maybe we could do this whole stop in Belgrade thing and maybe they won't be as mad. Because, the Russians were like, okay, they killed your fucking like heir to the empire. It makes sense that you're mad.
Yeah. Justifiable.
And if the Austrians were a bit more reasonable with what they wanted and what they were going to do about it, then the Russians may not have gotten involved. Well, as kind of a show of force / hey, pussy, stop doing what you're doing, the Russians started to mobilize. But the thing about the Russians mobilizing is there are so many people and their training system sucked so bad, it would take them several weeks to get ready. And it was more like a, hey, calm down. Well, the Germans see this and they're like, oh, fuck, the Austrians are about to get attacked. They're like our only ally because everyone else hates us. So then they start mobilizing for war. And the Russians are like, ho, 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 what are you doing? Why are you mobilizing for war? We're not actually going to war. But they're like, hey, maybe you should stop mobilizing and then we'll stop mobilizing. But then they're like, we're already mobilizing. We can't stop now. So then they just both keep mobilizing. And the next part of this that makes this even more stupid is the Germans, their mobilization plan is called the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan that was created by General Schlieffen in 1902, 1903, something like that, expected there to be a two-front war. If there was going to be a war that happened, they would have to fight both France and Russia at the same time. So the plan was to set up a defensive barrier against Russia in the east and hold out against Russia, but then kick the shit out of France in the west and then fight everyone against Russia, which is a plan that makes sense because there are a lot of Russians.
Yeah.
So in order to accomplish this, they had to do this kind of sweep motion to get the French. Well, the best way they thought to do that would be to go through Belgium because there aren't as many defenses in Belgium as there are France. Best part of that plan would be, hey, Belgium, let us through. Let us go through your country and then we'll attack the French and we'll leave you alone. So that's their plan, right? They're going to attack the French, get them out of the war, and then attack the Russians. Well, Dreyfus was not a spy, but there were plenty of other ones in the French army and the German army. To a point where the French knew exactly what the Germans' plans were.
Amazing.
And the Germans knew exactly what the French plans were. So they knew they were going to attack them from the outset of the war. And then they saw them mobilizing and moving troops towards Belgium. And they were like, I wonder what's about to happen. So then the French start mobilizing for war. You've got all this shit happening, right? Austria is not far from attacking and completely being a failure because they're Austrian. And Britain's sitting over here like, do I give a fuck? Initially, they say no, because it's a continental conflict and it sounds like not my fucking problem. So they're chilling, right? They're chilling. It's, July crisis. So it's July. And up until this point, the British and the French kind of had talks that were like, hey, if for whatever reason Russia and Germany fight each other over the Balkans, do you really need to join the war? And the French were like, no, not really. They'll be fine. So Britain, knowing this, sent envoys to the Germans and were like, hey, if you guys just don't attack the French, they probably won't join the war. And the German generals were like, that's great, but we already have plans to attack the French. Can't change them.
You can't. Why can't they change them?
Well, and that's what everyone else said. Why can't you change the plans? They were like, we just can't. And they did that for so long that they were already in place. And the trains had already moved the people towards Belgium and could now not get them back to Russia in time.
Holy shit.
So, not being able to reach any kind of fucking agreement on not attacking the French, they start to attack the French.
Yep. Uh-huh.
And how do they do that? They roll through Belgium. You want to know who didn't let them go through Belgium? The Belgians. Turns out, the Belgians were supposed to be considered a neutral country. You want to know what you also don't do to neutral countries? Attack them. And it turns out that the British really like neutrality.
Mm-hmm.
So, as the Germans are just fucking steamrolling the Belgians, because they're just little Belgium and they're getting fucked, the British are like, hey, why are you doing this? Not fucking cool. And the Germans are like, it's part of the plan. We can't change it. And then the British are like, yeah, okay, sorry, we're done. Cut political ties and then go to war on the side of the French. So then you have World War I start, and it's a complete shit show from start to finish. One, how did these people get into power? Two, how did they stay there long enough to fuck everything up this bad?
Why did no one
Three,
care?
How did they all happen to be in power at the same time? Why did they care? Why didn't they care is a good question. Why didn't they care is because they thought, oh, hey, we've got all this new technology that's going to be really good for attacking. The wars will be over quick. Everyone who believed, because the fighting really started to begin in August, and everyone said on every side, the war will be over by Christmas. Confirmed. Done. Will not last longer than Christmas. Couple months. They did not keep saying that in 1918 when it was still going, because they didn't realize that the technology they had for the defense was a whole lot better than the technology they had for the attack. Well, actually they had good technology for attack as well, but they didn't have very good tactics, because they still thought that they would be able to cavalry charge with their horses into machine gun. That did not go very well. And there's a lot that I didn't mention here, like the main Austrian chief of staff, Konrad von Hotzendorf, who was a complete fucking moron, and above everyone else said Austria needed to attack Serbia, no matter what. And he was pushing and pushing and pushing for like 2 and 3 weeks after the guy died to get them to do something. And then they did. When people say it's this country's fault that the war happened, most of the time they say Germany, because they told Austria they could do whatever they wanted. I still feel like it's mostly Austria's fault, because what they did was, one, it was not at the same caliber of what happened to the Archduke, and the response time was so slow that it was so very obviously them trying to get shit out of Serbia that everyone knew that, right? Even if it was faster, they still would have known it. But it was just obvious because they did it a month later after he was dead. This
is stupid. This is like beyond stupid.
Yeah.